Hi guys, welcome to the last week of term and to today's video. So the idea of this is that we're going to go through some top quotes to revise for the character of Macbeth, and all of these are ones that were chosen by you in our activities last week, and generally the ones that prove the most popular in terms of people endorsing or commenting. Having said that, it's not an exclusive list. You could choose another 5 or 6 quotes without using any of these and produce an equally good list to revise for Macbeth. After all, he is the main character. But if you revise these quotes, that would be a really good platform for a question on the character of Macbeth. So what I'm going to do is just go through each of them, and for each one try and provide a basic comment on it, a simple but good point you could make about the quote. Then provide something that's a little bit more sophisticated, a deeper comment or interpretation of the quote. And lastly, because an important part of your answer for Macbeth is going to be linking in what you're discussing with the structure of the whole play, I'm going to link each of these quotes into the structure of the play or to another part of the play. Okay, so that's the plan, and there'll be an activity for you to do following on from that on Share My Homework. Okay, here's the first quote, and it comes from right near the beginning of the play. Whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs. So Act 1, Scene 3. I think if it wasn't labelled with where it was from in the play, most people might guess it was from a later part of the play. Say, for example, when Macbeth sees the ghost of Banquo. But in actual fact, he says these lines when he's thinking about the prospect of what he might have to do to become king. So he's heard the prophecy of the witches, and he's looking forward to the idea that that might lead to him killing Duncan, and this is his reaction. Okay, well, you can see one student's response to this on the Padlet is there on the screen. It tells us something about Macbeth's conscience. The fact he's so disturbed by the thought of murder shows he has a conscience, and that contrasts with later on in the play. And that's certainly an accurate interpretation of this quote. What else could he say? We could also say it's particularly striking because Macbeth is a soldier, a warrior, and in Act 1, Scene 2, the presentation of Macbeth was as someone who was completely fearless, who nothing could frighten. And therefore, when we then see this quote, just something in his mind has almost traumatized him in this way. It emphasizes perhaps the wrongness of what he is thinking about, which is killing the king. Even somebody like the Macbeth we've been introduced to in the previous scene can respond in this way. Lastly, thinking about the play as a whole, the student has pointed out, who's quoted on the screen, that Macbeth here is frightened by something in his imagination, and by the end of the play he says he's almost forgotten the taste of fear. So that backs up that point. But there's also there's another point that can be made, and it's this. We've got this kind of parallel between this scene, when he's imagining killing Duncan, and Act 2, Scene 2, when he's actually killed Duncan. Because at that point in the play, we have this knocking on the door of the castle, and Macbeth is then disturbed by this real physical knocking. So he describes his heart knocking at his ribs here. That's internal, the sort of fear and dread of what he's thinking about doing. Once he's done it, that becomes external, and that sort of motif of knocking links these two scenes together, and that sort of wrong desire which was inside him has now been externalized, and it shows that he's given in to that temptation, to that evil. Okay, quote 2 links again to temptation. Stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. So we've talked about this one a lot in class in the past, and it's quite a well-known quote. So the first thing you might think to talk about would be the adjectives black and deep. Simple words, but lots you can sort of say in terms of the connotations of evil that might sort of be thought of with like a black-hearted character, but also the connotations of darkness and secrecy, linking to that idea of deep desires, something he's keeping within himself. And as we've seen, he can't keep that inside himself forever. The previous quote tells us the internal becomes external. Black and deep desires. I think that word desire is interesting as well, the noun. That idea that this is almost something primal and instinctive, this lust for power that he feels. And of course we often hear desire used in the sense of lust. The idea is something perhaps Macbeth's not fully in control of. There's lots you can say about the language in this quote. Something else that's worth saying, but perhaps we've not discussed it before, is the idea of the imperative here. Stars, hide your fires. He is instructing the stars, not himself, he's instructing those stars. When you think about the status of the stars and how the stars can be linked to destiny and linked to God, there's something there in terms of what's revealed about Macbeth, that ego, that confidence that he feels he can instruct those stars. Okay, and in terms of the structure of the play, well, just like with quote 1, we see this early part of the play, when he's beginning to entertain the idea of killing Duncan, links up with the later part of the play when he does that deed. So just before he goes off to murder Duncan, we see Banquo and Fleance keeping watch, and that's where we hear this quote, Act 2, Scene 1, there's husbandry in heaven, their candles are all out. So Macbeth makes this command, stars hide your fires, in Act 1, and then by the start of Act 2 there are no stars in the sky. Almost as if at this stage in the play it seems as if the heavens or destiny are following Macbeth's desires and Macbeth's commands. Okay, quote number 3 is here. I dare do all that may become a man, who dares do more is none. And this comes in Act 1, Scene 7, so Lady Macbeth is trying to persuade Macbeth to go through with the killing of Duncan by suggesting that if he doesn't do it, it's because he's not man enough, it's some failing in his manhood. And he responds by saying, not at all. Anything that a man should do, he'll do, but he won't go past that point. And I think, unlike quote 2, it's not desperately interesting linguistically, but this quote is really interesting thematically, because masculinity and gender in general is sort of quite a recurring theme in the play. And Macbeth, again we go back to the sort of presentation of Macbeth at the very start, that Macbeth is this hyper-masculine figure, or this idealized man. He's a warrior, he's a fighter, he's a leader, he takes responsibility, he's a winner, and he's introduced in those terms. But Macbeth himself in this scene is almost suggesting there is another element to being a man apart from those things. He suggests manliness is about morality as well as might. If he goes over the line by killing somebody innocent and by killing the king, he will not be proving his manhood, but just the opposite. And it's actually a different sort of type of masculinity, maybe from the one that we see elsewhere in the play, that masculinity in terms of might. So that's one interpretation here that I think is interesting. But we could also look at it in a slightly different way, and we could think about the idea of man rather as man and woman, man and humanity, mankind, and this idea that when Macbeth gives in to his own desire and his wife's persuasion and murders Duncan, he's giving up his humanity, that Macbeth, as the play goes on, becomes animal rather than human. And that makes sense in the context of where Macbeth elsewhere in the play is described using animal language. He's compared to a lion, an eagle, a serpent, a bear. And talking of animals, quote 4 is from Act 3. Full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. And you've got a couple of your comments on that quote there on the screen. And it's certainly true. It shows the mental stress that is caused to Macbeth by the thought of the things he's done to gain power, but also by his focus on the need to maintain power, the feeling of danger and not being safe. And mental stress, yes, and also this idea that he's almost being worn down, as the student says here, from the inside. And the scorpion, I think, is an effective kind of image from that. Things like stress and trauma and fear are abstract. The idea of an animal running around inside the skull makes that image concrete to us. So the metaphor makes this much easier for us to understand, and it's that very visual image. We can imagine a scorpion, but actually it's also a tactile image. We can almost feel that thing scampering around with its short, sharp claws inside our own skull. So we could talk about the way that Shakespeare uses sensual imagery there to get that point across. We could also talk about the idea of a motif, so a recurring image, because the student here points out the poison of a scorpion sting here, that his brain is being affected not just by something running around, but by poison. And poison is a recurring symbol throughout the text. We see it, for example, with Lady Macbeth in Act 1. She wants to pour poison in Macbeth's ear, or she wants to swap the milk in her breasts for poison or gall. And so that motif continues here. Another motif in the play is clothing, and we see that in quote 5. Now does he feel his title hanging loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. So this is a description of Macbeth rather than Macbeth's own statement, but it clearly suggests, as a student in the first interpretation on screen there says, that Macbeth is unworthy of his title. And they've made the structural point here as well, in that contrasts very strongly with the beginning of the play, and we're now near the end of the play, where Macbeth is repeatedly and relentlessly praised for everything he does. So this is a nice quote to show Macbeth's journey. Also, we can make the point that Shakespeare is using the method of contrast. Duncan is compared to a giant, Macbeth to a dwarf, and that image emphasises how Macbeth has fallen short as king. And of course the thematic point here is the robe doesn't fit him. So in other words, he is not suited to the position of king. He's not made for it, and he tries to take what belongs to somebody else, and the consequences for him as well as for the country are bad. So this quote can be read as well almost as a warning about taking power or being overly ambitious, because it doesn't get him anywhere. If you imagine that giant robe on this dwarfish figure, not only would it look ridiculous, it would be impractical. If the coat is far too big, the person can barely move. They certainly won't be comfortable. So power, we see here, does not, for Macbeth, bring happiness. At the start of the play, Macbeth understood that when he is hailed as Thane of Cawdor, he says, "Why do you dress me in borrowed robes?" This isn't the job for him. But somewhere along the line, he's lost that perspective. He's lost that sense of what is right and wrong. And that's what leads, that ambition and loss of perspective is what leads to the tragedy of Macbeth. Okay, hopefully there's some useful ideas there to help with your revision of the character of Macbeth. Now that you've watched the video, then go back to Show My Homework and have a go at the activities there. I'll see you later.